Balancing chemical equations. If you've ever played with a set of Legos, then you know that there's more than one way to put together the Legos to create something. Well, this is the same with elements in a chemical equation. Elements and compounds can be disassembled to make different compounds from the same elements. So we need to go ahead and learn in chemical equations how we can rearrange sets of atoms into new compounds and make sure they follow the law of conservation of mass, saying that everything that we start with is the same as the amount of everything we end with. Now, when chemists look at chemical reactions and they write it out as an equation, they can't just start with, for example, one mercury and one oxygen on one side, and then have a mercury and two oxygens on the other side, because this would just be going against the law of conservation of mass. But they also just can't throw a random number anywhere they want to make it balanced, because either it would be incorrect or that actual compound just doesn't exist in nature. So to fix this, there needs to be a process called balancing. And balancing equations doesn't change what happens in the reaction, it just changes the way the chemical reaction is represented. The balancing process involves changing coefficients, or those large numbers in front of the compounds. And in a reaction, we want to achieve a balanced chemical equation. Now, a balanced chemical equation is going to have the same number of atoms in each element on both sides of the equation. So it's important to note that when balancing equations, the only number that changes is the coefficient in front of the compounds. We never ever touch the subscripts in the chemical equations. Balancing equations is more often a trial and error process. It will take you sometimes going back and forth between the reactants and product side until you achieve a balanced equation. So we're going to go over some steps to start helping you with balancing chemical equations. The first step to balancing a chemical equation is to write out the chemical equation. You want to make sure that your reactants are on your left and your products are on your right. You may also want to double check that your subscripts are correct if there are any, especially if we're copying from a page onto a worksheet. Another tip you want when balancing is to leave a little space in front of each compound in order to place a coefficient there if needed. And of course, it's best if you're using a pencil because we may have to do some erasing as we go back and forth with the balancing. The next step of balancing equations is to count the atoms in the reactants and the products. The best way to do this is to set up a small table right underneath your equation. If you want to list out all the atoms, and in this case it's going to be sodium, bromine, and chlorine. I personally like to draw a line down the table right through my table, and I count the atoms on the reactant side. Here we can see I have one sodium on my reactant side, one bromine on my reactant side, and two chlorines on the reactant side. Going over to the product side, I have one sodium, two bromines, and one chlorine. So when looking at this, I can easily see that the sodium is balanced on both sides of the equation, but the bromine and chlorine are not. Therefore, this equation is not balanced, so we need to move on to the next step. Step 3, we are going to start choosing coefficients to help balance the equation. Remember, we are not going to touch the subscripts when balancing equations. A good hint is if there is an even number of an element on one side and an odd number on the other side, a good rule of thumb is to place the coefficient 2 in front of the compound containing an odd number of atoms. So here I can see bromine has one atom on my reactant side and two on the product side. So I'm going to place the coefficient 2 in front of the compound that contains one bromine atom. As you can see now, once I've done that, I'm going to change the table. Because I added that to the front of this compound, I now have two sodiums and I now have two bromines. We're going to now do the same thing looking at chlorine. Since the odd number of chlorine is on the compound, on the product side, we are going to add the coefficient in front of the compound. So now we adjust our table again on the product side, and we now have two sodiums and two chlorines. The final step would be to recheck the numbers of each atom on both sides. So in this case, we now have 2 sodiums, 2 bromines, and 2 chlorines, and this equation is now balanced. Fantastic job. Let's take a break, and it's time for you to show what you know.